Daniel had not returned to the farmhouse in many years. When he stepped off the bus and began walking down the narrow road that led toward the land, he felt both strange and familiar emotions pressing on him. The field stretched wide on either side, though most of them were no longer planted. Grass and weeds had grown tall and the fences leaned with age, as if they were tired of standing. The autumn air smelled faintly of earth and dry hay, and for a moment Daniel thought he could almost hear his grandfather's voice calling him the way he used to as a child. He remembered running through these same fields barefoot, chasing after butterflies and falling into the soft dirt. He remembered the way the old farmhouse had seemed larger than life to him, with its wooden beams and the smell of bread that his grandmother used to bake. But now, walking toward it as an adult, he noticed the peeling paint on the windows, the shutters that hung loosely, and the way the porch creaked when he stepped on it. The place looked forgotten, almost abandoned, as if the world had moved on and left it behind. The door was already open, and inside were voices. Daniel paused for a moment, listening. His cousins, uncles, and aunts were gathered in the living room, their words sharp and tired. They were speaking about his grandfather's estate, what little was left after the years of debts, sales, and struggles. Daniel stepped inside quietly, not wanting to make a scene. But the moment they noticed him, the air grew colder. One of his cousins, Marcy, crossed her arms and said in a flat tone, "You should know before you ask. Daniel, there's nothing left for you to inherit." Her words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't come here for that," he said softly, though he could feel their eyes doubting him. Another cousin shrugged. "Well, it doesn't matter. Grandpa had to sell off almost everything before he passed. The land is worth little now and the house barely stands. There's nothing to fight over." Daniel felt a strange ache in his chest, not because of the money, he truly hadn't expected any, but because of the way they said it. It was as if his grandfather's life had been reduced to an empty balance sheet, as if the laughter, the stories, and the long summer days in these rooms meant nothing at all. He walked deeper into the house, his hand brushing against the old furniture. The rocking chair where his grandfather had spent countless evenings sat in the corner, worn smooth from years of use. The walls held faint marks where family pictures had once hung, now gone, leaving pale outlines in the faded paint. Dust covered the shelves, but Daniel could still smell faint traces of tobacco, wood polish, and the warmth of a place once alive with people. As the family continued their discussions in the next room, Daniel slipped away. He wanted to see the fields again. He wanted to breathe in the air and remember something more than numbers and arguments. Stepping outside, he walked down the worn path to the fields. The sky was a gentle gray with clouds drifting slowly, and a light wind carried the sound of rustling grass. He stopped when he saw the Scarecrow. It stood just as it had when he was a boy, tall and slightly crooked, dressed in an old plaid shirt and straw hat. Its wooden arms stretched wide, and though its colors had faded, it still kept its place in the field like a silent guard. Daniel smiled faintly. His grandfather had always been proud of that Scarecrow. "Keeps more than birds away," he used to say with a mysterious grin. At the time, Daniel had laughed, not understanding what he meant. To him it had been nothing more than a bundle of straw with clothes. But now, looking at it again, Daniel felt something different. The Scarecrow stood with a kind of stubbornness, as if refusing to fall despite the years of storms and neglect. He walked closer and touched the wooden post that held it. The wood felt stronger than he expected, smoother, as if someone had worked on it carefully. Strange, he thought. Most things on the farm had given in to age, but this stood as if it had a purpose. He sat on the ground nearby, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He often carried it with him, jotting down thoughts or sketches when he felt overwhelmed. As he looked at the Scarecrow, his mind filled with memories of his grandfather's hands. Strong, steady, and always busy with tools. His grandfather had been the kind of man who could fix anything, from a broken chair to a squeaky hinge. He built with patience, not for wealth, but because he believed in making things last. Daniel realized, sitting there, that what hurt him the most was not the lack of inheritance, but the silence of the house without his grandfather's voice. The old man had never spoken much about money. He had spoken about honesty, about hard work, and about leaving something meaningful behind. Daniel wondered what that really meant. Was it just memories? Was it just lessons? Or was there something else, something nobody else had noticed? The wind picked up, and the Scarecrow's hat tilted slightly, revealing a corner of wood beneath the straw that looked too carefully carved to be accidental. Daniel leaned forward, curiosity stirring. But he stopped himself, not yet. For now he only stared, letting the moment linger. As the evening light began to fade, Daniel rose and made his way back to the farmhouse. He passed his family again, still locked in their talk of bills and losses. They barely looked up at him, but Daniel carried a different thought in his heart. A quiet question about what his grandfather had truly left behind, and why the Scarecrow still stood so firmly when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Daniel woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen. The farmhouse was quiet, and even the distant sounds of the town seemed muffled by the fields around him. He didn't feel like returning to the discussions with his family. Instead, he wanted to explore the land, the way he had when he was a boy, hoping to find some connection to the grandfather he missed more than he could say. The fields stretched endlessly before him, golden with the last colors of autumn. Leaves crunched under his feet as he walked along the overgrown paths. Many of the fences had fallen, and the wooden gates hung crooked, swaying slightly in the breeze. Yet amidst the disorder, there was a sense of life that the town had never offered him, a quiet persistence of nature, stubbornly growing and spreading, just as his grandfather always had with his projects. Daniel's eyes returned to the Scarecrow in the center of the largest field. Its figure seemed taller than he remembered, and its posture, almost upright, suggested a kind of dignity. He approached it carefully, brushing the rough straw from its shoulders, and examined the wooden post that anchored it to the ground. His grandfather's hands, he thought, must have shaped it with care. He ran his fingers along the grooves in the wood, feeling the texture of something more than ordinary. For a long time, Daniel simply watched the field. Memories drifted back in fragments. The smell of fresh bread from the farmhouse kitchen, the way his grandfather's hands smelled of sawdust and polish, and the countless afternoons he had spent learning small lessons about patience, care, and attention. The Scarecrow had always been part of these memories, but today, it seemed almost like a signal, a clue that perhaps there was more to discover, more to understand about the man who had shaped his childhood. Daniel decided to walk further. The paths were narrow and uneven, and the tall grass occasionally brushed against his legs. He noticed the wildflowers still clinging stubbornly to the edges of the fields, their colors muted but persistent. He bent down to touch a small cluster of blue flowers, and in that simple act he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. Here in these fields, life went on quietly, without need for explanation or dispute. As he walked, he noticed remnants of his grandfather's work scattered throughout the property. A broken wheelbarrow leaned against a fence, its metal rusted but still solid. A row of wooden boxes, long empty, hinted at where vegetables or flowers might have once grown. Daniel began to see the land not as abandoned or forgotten, but as a canvas that had once been filled with intention, care, and purpose. He could almost feel the hands that had planted, built, and nurtured each part of it. His curiosity about the Scarecrow grew stronger. He circled it, examining every inch of the post, the straw, and the old clothes it wore. Something about it seemed deliberate, as though it was more than a decoration meant to scare away birds. He noticed a small knot in the wood, a place that seemed oddly carved. Leaning closer, he pressed his hand against it and felt a hollow space beneath the surface. A thrill of discovery ran through him. His grandfather had always loved hiding small surprises, teaching lessons in subtle ways. Could this be one of them? For hours, Daniel stayed in the field, exploring the edges and corners he had once ignored as a boy. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the earth, and yet the Scarecrow remained at the center, watching silently over the land. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell, that every tool, every building, every object on the farm had a purpose beyond the obvious. Perhaps this Scarecrow, too, was hiding a secret he had yet to uncover. Eventually, Daniel returned to the farmhouse for a short rest. The kitchen smelled faintly of the old wood and something faintly sweet, like a memory rather than a current scent. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out over the fields. In that quiet moment, he realized how much he had missed this place, not for what it could give him in terms of money or possessions, but for the feeling of connection it offered. Here, he could think, remember, and imagine. After a brief pause, he returned to the field. He knelt by the Scarecrow again, examining it more closely. His fingers traced the rough edges of the post, feeling for anything unusual. After a few moments, he noticed what seemed like a small latch, hidden beneath the layers of straw and cloth. His heart began to race. Could it be? Had his grandfather left something for him to find? Daniel's hands worked carefully, gently lifting the straw and pulling aside the old fabric. There behind the clothes and stuffing was a wooden panel. It had been carved and fitted so carefully that it was nearly invisible. A sense of wonder and anticipation filled him. His grandfather had always been meticulous, always thinking 2 steps ahead. This must have been one of his secret projects, something he wanted only someone observant enough to discover. As he examined the panel, Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and respect. He realized that this was more than a physical object, it was a message, a continuation of the lessons his grandfather had taught him as a child. It was a reminder that life was not just about what was visible, but about what could be discovered with patience, care, and attention. Hours passed, and Daniel continued to explore the area around the Scarecrow. He noticed faint trails in the grass, likely made by small animals, and the subtle changes in the soil where his grandfather had once planted seeds. Everything felt alive in a quiet way, and Daniel began to see the patterns his grandfather had left behind. He could almost imagine him walking these fields, making adjustments, checking the soil, and ensuring that each plant and structure was just right. As the day drew to a close, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had returned to the farmhouse expecting disappointment, only to discover a mystery that reminded him of the values his grandfather had cherished: patience, observation, and respect for the world around him. The Scarecrow, once a simple figure in a field, had become a symbol of all that his grandfather had built, not just in terms of land and objects, but in the lessons and care that shaped a life. As he walked back to the farmhouse, Daniel felt a quiet determination growing within him. He would not leave without discovering the full story. He knew there was more to uncover, more of his grandfather's work hidden in plain sight, and he was ready to follow every clue. For the first time in years, he felt a deep connection to the place, a sense of belonging that went far beyond material inheritance. That night, as he lay in the old guest room, Daniel could still picture the Scarecrow standing tall in the fading light. Its figure, framed against the wide fields and the setting sun, seemed almost alive.
He realized that this was just the beginning.
The farmhouse, the fields, and the secrets they held were calling him, inviting him to look deeper and to carry forward the legacy his grandfather had left behind. Not in money or objects, but in wisdom, care, and the joy of discovery. With that thought, Daniel drifted into sleep, dreaming of fields full of light, of hands shaping wood, and of a man who had always known that the greatest treasures were not counted in coins, but in the care one takes in building a life worth remembering. The next morning, Daniel woke with a sense of anticipation. He could not stop thinking about the Scarecrow and the hidden panel he had discovered the day before. Every moment since his arrival at the farmhouse had seemed to build toward this. He dressed quickly, grabbed a small notebook and a flashlight, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sky was pale blue with streaks of gold as the sun rose over the fields. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the wind carried a fresh, earthy scent that made him take a deep breath and smile. He walked toward the Scarecrow, his steps careful on the uneven ground. The fields were quiet, almost reverent, as if they, too, knew something important was about to happen. The Scarecrow stood in the center of the field, looking as upright and mysterious as ever. Daniel approached it slowly, feeling a strange mix of excitement and respect. He knelt by the base and studied the panel again. Yesterday he had only brushed aside the straw and cloth, but today he wanted to explore further. As he examined the wood, Daniel noticed a faint crack running along one side of the panel. The edges were smooth, but the crack suggested that the panel could be pried open with some care. He hesitated for a moment, thinking about how careful his grandfather had always been with his work. Every detail had meaning. Taking a deep breath, he gently pressed his fingers along the crack and applied slight pressure. With a quiet click, the panel shifted, revealing a small hidden compartment beneath the Scarecrow. Daniel's eyes widened. Inside the compartment, he found a collection of old notebooks, bundles of papers, and small hand-carved objects wrapped in soft cloth. His grandfather had always loved to build things, and here, hidden beneath the Scarecrow, were the fruits of that passion. He carefully lifted the notebooks and began flipping through them. The pages were filled with sketches, diagrams, and handwritten notes in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Each page told a story of creativity, patience, and attention to detail. He read about inventions that his grandfather had been working on for years. Simple machines, tools, and devices designed to make life easier on the farm. Some of them were never finished, but the sketches showed thought, care, and ingenuity. Other pages contained reflections on life, advice written as if for someone he loved and trusted. Daniel could feel his grandfather's presence in the words, a voice that guided him even though the man was no longer alive. As he explored the compartment, Daniel found a small wooden box. Inside were tiny carved figures of animals and people, each carefully detailed. His grandfather had always been good with his hands, but seeing the figures now hidden for so many years, Daniel realized how much effort had gone into each one. They were not toys, not decorations, they were expressions of creativity, patience, and care. His grandfather had poured his heart into these objects, leaving a piece of himself for someone who would notice. A sudden gust of wind shook the Scarecrow. Daniel stepped back, startled, and the figure swayed dangerously. For a moment it seemed as though it might fall completely. But then, as if guided by some invisible hand, the Scarecrow shifted, leaning forward slightly, and toppled gently onto the ground. Daniel froze for a moment, his heart racing. The fall revealed even more than the hidden panel. Beneath the Scarecrow was a small hatch, perfectly built into the earth. Daniel knelt down and brushed away the soil around the hatch. It was small, just big enough for him to open and look inside. The hatch was locked with a simple wooden latch, worn smooth by time but still functional. He lifted it carefully and peered into the space below. A small underground workshop lay before him, illuminated faintly by the light filtering through the hatch. It smelled of wood, polish, and the faint trace of old tools, a familiar, comforting scent that reminded him of countless afternoons spent with his grandfather in the workshop. The space was modest but full of treasures. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding more notebooks, tools, and half-finished projects. A small workbench sat in the center, covered with scraps of wood and metal, sketches pinned to the wall above. Daniel could see the care and thought that had gone into every corner of the room. His grandfather had built this space not for fame or money, but for the joy of creation. Each object, each sketch was a testament to a life lived with purpose. He spent hours exploring the workshop, picking up tools, turning pages of notebooks, and examining the small inventions his grandfather had made. There were simple machines designed to lift heavy objects, small devices to water plants efficiently, and clever tools for woodworking. Daniel marveled at the ingenuity and precision of each piece. He realized that his grandfather's real inheritance was not in land or money, but in knowledge, skill, and the inspiration to create something meaningful. As he worked through the notebooks, Daniel found a letter addressed to him. It was folded carefully and tucked into the pages of a sketchbook. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar and steady, the words filled with encouragement, wisdom, and love. The letter spoke about the value of patience, the importance of observing the world carefully, and the joy of building something with one's own hands. His grandfather had written it as a guide, a way to help Daniel find purpose and connection even in difficult times. Daniel read the letter slowly, absorbing each word. He felt a warmth in his chest, a connection to the grandfather he had loved and missed. The workshop, the notebooks, and the letter were all part of a legacy that was deeper and more meaningful than anything money could provide. His grandfather had built not just tools and objects, but a life philosophy that Daniel could carry forward. The day passed quickly, though Daniel barely noticed. He moved from one corner of the workshop to another, exploring every detail, examining every object, and reading every note. The Scarecrow, now lying gently on the ground above, seemed to watch over him like an old friend. He understood now why his grandfather had placed it there, not to scare anyone away, but to guard this secret, to ensure that only someone who cared enough would find it. As the sun began to set, Daniel stepped out of the hatch and looked at the Scarecrow in a new light. What had seemed like a simple figure in the field was actually a key, a marker of curiosity, patience, and observation. His grandfather had trusted him to discover this, to carry forward the knowledge and values that had guided his life. Daniel felt a sense of responsibility but also excitement. He had found not just objects and notes, but a connection to his family, his past, and himself. That evening, Daniel returned to the farmhouse, carrying a few notebooks and tools with him. He felt tired but satisfied, his mind alive with ideas and inspiration. As he sat by the window looking out at the fields where the Scarecrow had stood, he realized that the true inheritance was not something that could be counted or measured. It was something that could be felt, understood, and shared. He thought about the words his cousins had said. "There's nothing left for you to inherit." Now he understood that they had been wrong. There was everything left for him to inherit: wisdom, creativity, patience, and the love his grandfather had poured into every corner of the farm. The Scarecrow, the hidden compartment, and the workshop were all proof of that. As night fell, Daniel made a quiet promise to himself. He would take care of this place, not for money or recognition, but for the lessons it held and the connection it gave him to his grandfather. He would continue the work, learn from it, and perhaps one day, pass it on to someone else who would appreciate it as deeply as he did. With that thought, he closed the farmhouse door gently, feeling the weight of the day and the promise of the future. The fields were dark now, but the memory of the Scarecrow and what it had revealed glowed brightly in his mind. Daniel went to sleep that night with a sense of purpose, knowing that he had discovered something far greater than he had ever imagined, a legacy of care, creativity, and quiet, enduring wisdom. Daniel spent the next morning returning to the small underground workshop. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the fields. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of earth and wood. He felt a sense of excitement as he approached the hatch where the Scarecrow had fallen the day before. The figure still lay gently on the ground, its straw-stuffed body looking almost like a quiet guardian of the secret below. He knelt by the hatch, lifted the wooden latch, and carefully slid open the door. The workshop smelled faintly of old wood, polish, and dust, but it was a comforting scent, full of memories he couldn't explain. Daniel climbed down slowly, careful not to disturb anything. As soon as he reached the floor, he took a deep breath and looked around. The room was small, but every inch seemed full of life. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with notebooks, small carved objects, tools, and sketches. A workbench sat in the center, covered with unfinished projects and plans pinned above it. Daniel walked slowly around the workshop, his eyes tracing the objects his grandfather had built. He reached for a small wooden box and carefully opened it. Inside were tiny carved animals and people, each one perfectly detailed despite their size. There were birds, cats, horses, and even small figures of people doing everyday tasks. Daniel ran his fingers over the smooth wood and thought about the hours his grandfather must have spent making them. Each carving seemed to carry a story, a moment of life frozen in time. He turned to the notebooks stacked on the shelves. The pages were filled with sketches and diagrams, some of them inventions, others clever tools for everyday life. There were devices to make farm work easier, simple machines for lifting heavy objects, and tools designed to save time and energy. Some were unfinished, but the designs were clear and thoughtful. Daniel realized that his grandfather had spent his life learning, observing and creating not for money or recognition, but for the pure joy of solving problems and making life better. One notebook in particular caught his attention. Its pages were full of detailed sketches and careful instructions for building different devices. But in between the diagrams there were notes written in his grandfather's handwriting, thoughts about life, advice, and reflections. Daniel read one aloud softly. "Measure carefully, think before you act, and remember that patience is the greatest tool of all." The words made him smile. His grandfather had always been a quiet teacher, guiding him through actions rather than lectures. Now, even in his absence, he continued to teach. Daniel moved to the workbench in the center of the room. It was covered with half-finished projects: a small wooden cart, a birdhouse with intricate details, and a simple pulley system. Each project seemed to tell a story of care and thought. He picked up the pulley system and examined it. His grandfather had designed it to help move heavy objects without strain, but it was also a lesson in ingenuity and understanding how things worked. Daniel realized that every object in this workshop had a purpose beyond the obvious. They were lessons in creativity, problem-solving, and patience. As he continued to explore, Daniel noticed a stack of letters tucked into a corner. He picked them up and began reading. They were addressed to him, written by his grandfather over the years. Some were simple messages of encouragement, Others were reflections on life and advice for handling challenges. One letter described a day when his grandfather had been frustrated with a project that would not work. Instead of giving up, he had taken a step back, studied the problem, and tried again with a different approach. The lesson he had written was that perseverance often matters more than speed. Daniel felt a deep sense of connection to his grandfather as he read the letters. It was as if the man was there with him, guiding him through the workshop, showing him the value of care, thoughtfulness, and persistence. He understood now that the true inheritance was not money, land, or possessions, but the lessons and values his grandfather had left behind. The workshop was a treasure not because of what it contained, but because it represented a life lived with purpose and creativity. He spent the day examining each project, reading every notebook and thinking about the lessons hidden in plain sight. The sun moved across the sky, casting patterns of light through the small opening of the hatch. Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility. His grandfather had trusted him to discover this workshop, to understand its purpose and to carry forward the knowledge and values it held. He felt proud and honored, but also aware that this was only the beginning. There was much to learn, and he was determined to absorb it all. Daniel began taking notes in his own notebook, sketching some of the designs and writing down the lessons he learned. He copied diagrams of tools and machines, trying to understand how each one worked. Some were simple, others more complex, but each revealed the thought and care his grandfather had invested. He felt a sense of joy as he worked, a feeling he had not experienced in years. The process of learning, exploring, and discovering was exciting and fulfilling. He also began to think about how he could use what he had found. The workshop was more than a place of memories. It was a place of possibility. Daniel realized that he could continue his grandfather's work, apply the lessons he had learned, and perhaps even create new projects inspired by the designs he found. The thought filled him with energy and hope. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of direction and purpose. As the afternoon passed, Daniel found a small wooden cabinet with drawers labeled in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside, he discovered more tools, pieces of wood, and small metal parts. Each drawer seemed organized with intention, showing how much care his grandfather had put into the workshop. Daniel admired the organization, realizing that it reflected not only skill but also a mindset of planning, order, and respect for one's work. He spent hours experimenting with some of the tools, trying to understand how his grandfather had used them. The process was slow, but each small success brought satisfaction. He realized that the true gift of the workshop was not the objects themselves, but the lessons in thinking, observing, and creating. His grandfather had given him the tools to grow, to explore, and to build a life of meaning. By the time evening approached, Daniel had a sense of completion for the day, though he knew he had only just begun. He climbed out of the hatch carrying a few notes and sketches with him. The fields outside were bathed in the soft light of sunset, and the Scarecrow, though fallen, seemed to watch over him. He felt gratitude for the discovery, for the lessons, and for the connection to his grandfather. That night, as he lay in the old guest room, Daniel reflected on everything he had seen. The workshop was more than a hidden space. It was a symbol of a life dedicated to learning, creating, and leaving a meaningful legacy. He realized that his grandfather had carefully planned not just the objects in the workshop, but the way they would be discovered and appreciated by someone who truly cared. Daniel understood that he had been chosen to inherit not material wealth, but wisdom, creativity, and the inspiration to live a purposeful life. He fell asleep with the thought that the farmhouse, the fields, and the workshop were all gifts that went beyond money or land. They were reminders of the values his grandfather had cherished: patience, observation, creativity, and love for one's work. Daniel dreamed of the projects he might one day complete, inspired by the careful planning and passion of a man who had taught him, without words, that true inheritance is found in knowledge, care, and the joy of creation. Daniel woke early, feeling a mixture of excitement and calm. The farmhouse was quiet, with only the soft sounds of the morning breeze and distant birds filling the air. After a light breakfast, he stepped outside and walked toward the Scarecrow, still lying gently on the ground where it had fallen days before. The fields stretched endlessly, golden in the soft light of dawn. He felt a strong connection to the land, as if it were calling him to understand and carry forward what his grandfather had built. He knelt by the fallen Scarecrow and looked at the hidden compartment and the hatch below it. The workshop had already taught him so much, but Daniel realized that the real lessons were not just in the objects or notes, but in the way his grandfather had prepared everything with care, patience, and thoughtfulness. Every detail, every hidden element had a purpose. His grandfather had wanted Daniel to discover it all, to feel the joy of discovery and the satisfaction of understanding something carefully hidden. Daniel spent the morning returning to the workshop, reviewing the projects, sketches, and letters once again. He took time to study the designs, trying to understand the mechanics behind each tool and invention. He experimented with a few simple devices, testing how they worked and imagining how they could be used in daily life. The process was slow, but he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He realized that creating something with one's own hands, learning from mistakes, and improving through patience was more rewarding than anything he had experienced before. He thought about his family, who had dismissed the inheritance as worthless. They had not understood that the true value of his grandfather's legacy was not material, but in the knowledge, creativity, and wisdom he had left behind. Daniel felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had discovered it. The workshop, the hidden compartment, the Scarecrow, all of it had been a way for his grandfather to share something deeply meaningful with someone who would appreciate it. As the day progressed, Daniel began to plan how he could continue his grandfather's work. The workshop was full of potential. There were unfinished projects waiting to be completed, inventions waiting to be tested, and tools waiting to be used. He realized that he could spend years learning from these designs, improving them, and creating new projects inspired by his grandfather's methods. The thought excited him. He felt a sense of purpose he had never felt before. While exploring a small corner of the workshop, Daniel discovered a set of journals his grandfather had kept. These journals were different from the notebooks with designs. They contained reflections, stories, and advice. Some entries described everyday life on the farm, the challenges his grandfather faced, and the lessons he learned. Others were philosophical, filled with thoughts on patience, kindness, and the importance of creating something meaningful. Daniel read each entry carefully, feeling a deep connection to the man who had guided him without knowing it. One entry stood out. It described a day when his grandfather had been working on a complicated tool that did not function as intended. Instead of giving up, he had studied the problem, adjusted his approach, and eventually found a solution. He wrote about the satisfaction of solving a problem through careful observation and persistence. Daniel realized that this lesson applied not just to building tools, but to life itself. His grandfather had left him a guide on how to approach challenges, stay patient, and create something lasting. As he absorbed these lessons, Daniel thought about how he could honor his grandfather's legacy. He decided that the workshop should not remain a secret. While it was important that it had been discovered carefully, he wanted to share the knowledge, creativity, and lessons with others, not for money, not for recognition, but to inspire people to value patience, creativity, and careful work. He imagined teaching others how to build, create, and learn from mistakes, just as his grandfather had done. Daniel spent the afternoon organizing the workshop. He arranged the tools, sorted the notebooks, and created a system to make it easier to study and continue the projects. He took careful notes in his own journal, adding observations and ideas for improvements. Each action made him feel closer to his grandfather, as if he were working side by side with him. The sense of purpose and connection filled him with energy and motivation. Later, he stepped outside and looked at the fields. The Scarecrow, still lying on the ground, seemed like a marker of the journey he had taken, both literally and figuratively. It had led him to discover the hidden workshop, but it also symbolized the values his grandfather had lived by: patience, care, observation, and creativity. Daniel understood now that these values were the real inheritance, more valuable than any money or property could ever be. As evening approached, Daniel sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun set over the fields. The light painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the breeze carried the scent of the earth and the faint smell of wood from the workshop below. He felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. He had discovered a treasure that went beyond material wealth. He had found a connection to his grandfather, lessons for life, and a purpose that inspired him to move forward. That night, as he prepared for bed, Daniel thought about the future. He imagined himself completing the unfinished projects, teaching others what he had learned and continuing the work his grandfather had begun. The farmhouse and the fields were more than a home. They were a place of learning, creation, and inspiration. Daniel felt gratitude, not just for the inheritance he had received, but for the experience of discovering it and understanding its true value. Before sleeping, he opened his journal and wrote a few thoughts about patience, creativity, and the joy of learning from mistakes. He wrote about the Scarecrow, the hidden hatch, and the workshop, capturing the journey of discovery that had brought him closer to his grandfather. As he wrote, he felt a sense of purpose solidify within him. This was more than memory. It was a living legacy he could carry forward and share with others. The days that followed were filled with work and discovery. Daniel spent hours in the workshop, learning, experimenting, and building. Each project taught him something new. Each notebook revealed more insights, and each small success gave him confidence. He began to feel a connection not just to his grandfather, but to the values that had shaped him: care, patience, creativity, and a love for meaningful work. Eventually, Daniel knew it was time to involve his family. He shared his discoveries with them, explaining the hidden workshop, the notebooks, and the lessons contained within. He showed them the carvings, the tools, and the projects his grandfather had built. Slowly, their eyes opened to the value of what he had found. They began to understand that the true inheritance was not measured in money, but in knowledge, skill, and the joy of creation. In the end, Daniel realized that his grandfather had left him something far greater than material wealth.
He had left him a path, a way to live with purpose, patience, and creativity.
The Scarecrow, the hidden hatch, and the underground workshop were symbols of that legacy. Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. He knew that he would honor his grandfather's memory by continuing the work, sharing the lessons, and living a life guided by the values he had inherited. As he looked out at the fields one last time that evening, the Scarecrow now standing quietly in the distance, Daniel understood fully what his grandfather had intended. The real treasure was not something that could be bought or sold. It was knowledge, love, and the joy of creating something meaningful. And now it was his to carry forward, a gift that would last far longer than any object or piece of land. Daniel went to sleep that night feeling fulfilled, inspired, and at peace. He had discovered the true inheritance, one that would guide him, teach him, and inspire him for the rest of his life.